Sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the darkest places. Sometimes a single act of courage can wash away years of mistakes and transform two lives forever. This is the story of how a convicted felon became a hero in 60 seconds of pure terror, and how a young Apache girl's fight for survival became the redemption story that neither of them saw coming. What happens when society's forgotten prisoner faces a choice between his own safety and saving a stranger's life? What drives a man with nothing left to lose to risk everything for someone he's never met? The answer lies in the churning waters of a dangerous river, where split-second decisions revealed the true measure of human character. This is not just a story about rescue. This is a story about second chances, about the warrior spirit that flows through Apache blood, and about how sometimes the most profound acts of heroism happen when nobody is watching, except for the person whose life hangs in the balance. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Apache reservation as 17-year-old Maria Nietzsche made her way down the familiar path toward the river. The ancient cottonwoods whispered stories in the wind, their leaves dancing with the same rhythm that had echoed through her people's hearts for generations. Maria moved with the quiet grace that seemed to flow naturally through Apache women, her long black hair braided with small turquoise beads that caught the early light. She carried a worn leather water pouch and a bundle of sage, following a tradition her grandmother had taught her since childhood. Every morning for the past 3 years, Maria had come to this sacred bend in the river to collect water for the ceremonial blessing of their family's crops. The ritual connected her to her ancestors, to the land, and to the flowing spirit of the water that her people believed carried the voices of those who had come before. The river ran higher than usual this morning. Spring snowmelt from the distant mountains had swollen the normally gentle current into something more aggressive, more alive with dangerous energy. The water rushed past with a deep, throaty roar that seemed to vibrate through the earth beneath her feet. Maria paused at the water's edge, noting how the familiar rocks that usually provided easy stepping stones were now barely visible beneath the churning surface. She should have turned back. Her grandmother would have told her that the river spirits were restless today, that this was not a morning for ceremony. But Maria was young and confident, blessed with the fearlessness that often comes with 17 years of life, and the unshakable belief that bad things happen to other people, not to you. 3 miles upstream, the Riverside County work crew was beginning another day of highway maintenance. The prisoners wore orange jumpsuits that marked them as society's mistakes, men who had made choices that landed them on the wrong side of iron bars and razor wire. They worked under the watchful eyes of armed guards, their movements restricted by leg chains that clinked with each step along the roadside. Among them was Daniel Martinez, a 32-year-old man whose weathered hands and tired eyes told the story of someone who had seen too much of life's harder edges. Daniel had been serving an 18-month sentence for armed robbery, a desperate act born from addiction and poor choices that had cost him his family, his job, and nearly everything else that had once mattered to him. With only 3 months left on his sentence, he had begun to allow himself the dangerous luxury of hope. The work crew had been assigned to clear debris from the storm drains that ran beneath the highway bridge. Heavy rains 2 weeks earlier had clogged the drainage system with branches, trash, and accumulated sediment that threatened to cause flooding if not removed before the next storm system moved through. It was thankless work, the kind of job that society assigned to those it had deemed expendable. Daniel worked methodically, pulling waterlogged branches and twisted metal from the concrete channels. His movements were efficient but not eager. He had learned during his time inside that enthusiasm was often mistaken for brown-nosing, and brown noses didn't survive long in the complex social hierarchy of prison life. But as he worked, his eyes often drifted to the rushing water below, remembering summer days from his childhood when he and his younger brother would swim in these same waters. Officer Patricia Gonzalez supervised the work detail with the weary attention of someone who had seen enough escape attempts to know that constant vigilance was the price of keeping dangerous men in line. She stood near the bridge railing, her radio crackling occasionally with updates from other units, her hand never straying far from the pepper spray and taser on her utility belt. The morning was routine, predictable, safe. That was about to change. Maria had decided to try reaching the water from a fallen log that extended partway into the river. The massive cottonwood had toppled during a winter storm years earlier, and its trunk now formed a natural bridge that had served her well in the past. But the log was slippery with morning dew and algae, and the water beneath it was deeper and faster than she had ever seen it. She took her first step onto the log, feeling the solid wood beneath her beaded moccasins. Her second step was confident. By the third step, she was far enough from shore that falling would mean hitting deep, fast-moving water instead of the rocky shallows near the bank. The fourth step was where everything went wrong. Her foot hit a patch of algae that was slicker than ice. Her arms windmilled as she fought for balance, the water pouch flying from her grip to splash into the current below. For a moment that seemed to stretch like eternity, she teetered on the edge of catastrophe, her body swaying above the rushing water while her mind processed the terrible mathematics of momentum and gravity. Then she fell. The water hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and sending shocks of cold through her body that seemed to freeze her muscles in mid-motion. The current grabbed her immediately, pulling her under and spinning her in the disorienting darkness beneath the surface. She fought her way back to air, gasping and choking, her hair streaming across her face and blocking her vision. The river carried her along like a piece of debris, bouncing her off submerged rocks and rolling her through hydraulics that pulled her under again and again. Each time she surfaced, she had mere seconds to snatch a breath before the current dragged her down once more. The ceremonial dress that had seemed so appropriate for her morning ritual now became a weight that threatened to drag her to the bottom. Maria was a strong swimmer, but swimming in a pool or calm lake bore no resemblance to fighting for survival in a flood-swollen river that seemed determined to claim her life. The water was cold enough to sap her strength with frightening speed, and each impact with a rock or submerged log left her more battered and less able to fight effectively. She tried to angle toward shore, but the current was too powerful, carrying her downstream toward the highway bridge where the work crew labored. Unaware that a life-and-death drama was racing toward them, the roar of the water filled her ears, drowning out her own thoughts and replacing them with the primal terror of someone who could feel death reaching for her with icy fingers. Above on the bridge, Daniel Martinez was the first to spot the splash of orange and turquoise tumbling through the white water. His initial thought was that someone had lost a piece of equipment, maybe a traffic cone or construction material. But as his eyes focused on the object in the water, his brain processed details that made his heart skip. The splash of long black hair, the flash of a human face turned upward in desperate search of air, the unmistakable movement of someone fighting for their life. "Hey!" he shouted, pointing toward the water. "Somebody's in the river!" Officer Gonzalez followed his pointing finger, her training kicking in as she assessed the situation. She could see the figure in the water now. Clearly human, clearly in distress, being carried downstream by a current that was moving too fast for any conventional rescue attempt. Her radio was in her hand before she had fully processed the implications. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7 at the Highway 12 bridge." She spoke quickly into the device. "We have a possible drowning victim in the river. Request immediate emergency response and river rescue if available." Quote, "Process scenes of victims debate into an ailment." The radio crackled back with questions about location and victim status. But Officer Gonzalez was already calculating response times in her head. The nearest fire department with water rescue capability was 15 minutes away on a good day. The helicopter rescue unit was even further. Even if everything went perfectly, help would arrive too late to matter. The other prisoners had stopped working now, forming a loose group near the bridge railing to watch the drama unfolding below. Their conversations were a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine concern, but they were all united by the same grim understanding. They were witnessing someone die, and there was nothing any of them could do about it. Maria felt her strength ebbing with each passing second. The cold water had penetrated to her core, making her movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Her vision was beginning to blur from oxygen deprivation and the repeated impacts with underwater obstacles. She knew, with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of extreme crisis, that she was running out of time. She could see the bridge approaching through her water-blurred vision, and some part of her mind registered the orange-clad figures gathered along the railing. But she was too focused on survival to fully process what she was seeing. Her entire world had contracted to the immediate needs of staying conscious, staying afloat, and somehow finding a way to escape the river's deadly embrace. The current swept her under the bridge, past the gathered work crew, and into the stretch of river beyond. Officer Gonzalez ran along the bridge, trying to keep the victim in sight while coordinating with dispatch. The other officers from the detail had been called in to help, but their options were limited. The riverbank was steep and choked with brush in most places, making it nearly impossible to get rescue equipment to the water's edge, even if they had any. Daniel Martinez watched the figure disappear around a bend in the river, and something inside him broke open. Maybe it was the memory of his own daughter, whom he hadn't seen since his arrest. Maybe it was the realization that he was watching someone die while he stood safely behind a railing doing nothing. Maybe it was simply the recognition that this was a moment that would define who he really was, beneath all the mistakes and poor choices that had brought him to this place. He looked at the leg chains that connected his ankles, then at Officer Gonzalez, who was still focused on her radio communications. He looked at his fellow prisoners, who watched him with expressions that seemed to say they understood exactly what he was thinking and why he was thinking it. He looked back at the river, calculating distances and currents and the mathematics of a rescue attempt that would require him to remove his restraints and abandon the relative safety of the bridge. "Officer!" he called out, his voice cutting through the radio chatter. When Gonzalez turned toward him, he was already working at the clasps on his leg restraints. "I'm going in after her." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything that the criminal justice system was built on. Here was a convicted felon, a man society had deemed untrustworthy and dangerous, asking to be freed so he could risk his own life for a stranger. It was the kind of decision that could end careers and generate investigations and paperwork that would last for months. Officer Gonzalez looked at Daniel, then at the river where a young woman was fighting for her life, then back at Daniel. Her training told her that removing restraints from a prisoner was absolutely forbidden without direct authorization from a supervisor. Her conscience told her that sometimes rules existed to be broken when human lives hung in the balance. "You sure about this?" she asked, her hand hovering over her keys. Daniel was already pulling off his orange jumpsuit, revealing the white t-shirt and boxers underneath. His body was lean and muscular from years of hard physical labor, but his skin was pale from prison life, unmarked by the sun that would have bronzed him in his former life. "I grew up swimming in this river," he said, meeting her eyes. "I know these currents. I might be her only chance." The math was brutal and simple. Emergency responders were still minutes away. The victim had already been in the water for several minutes and was being carried further downstream with each passing second. Every moment of delay reduced the chances of a successful rescue. Officer Gonzalez made a decision that would be reviewed and questioned for months afterwards. She unlocked Daniel's restraints. "If you're going to do this, do it now," she said, stepping back to give him room. "And Martinez, don't make me regret this." Daniel kicked off his prison-issued boots and climbed over the bridge railing. The water looked much more dangerous from this angle, and he could feel doubt creeping into his mind like fog. He had been a good swimmer as a teenager, but that was more than 15 years ago, and the person drowning down there was already well downstream, being carried further away with each second he hesitated. But sometimes courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of fear because something more important than safety is at stake. Daniel Martinez took a deep breath, said a quick prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and jumped from the bridge into the churning water below. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent shocks of cold through his body, but his muscle memory took over, and he began to swim with powerful strokes toward the spot where he had last seen the drowning victim. Behind him on the bridge, Officer Gonzalez watched a convicted criminal transform into something else entirely. A man willing to risk everything to save someone he had never met. She keyed her radio and began the most difficult report of her career, knowing that she would spend months explaining why she had made the decision to trust a felon with another person's life. The river carried both swimmer and victim downstream, 2 lives now hanging in the balance where there had been one before, while somewhere in the distance, the sound of approaching sirens began to echo off the canyon walls. The water closed over Daniel's head like a fist, and for a moment he wondered if he had just committed the most elaborate suicide in the history of Riverside County. The current was stronger than he remembered, meaner than anything he had experienced during those carefree summer days of his youth. This wasn't the gentle river of his memories. This was a wild animal that seemed intent on destroying anything foolish enough to enter its domain. He surfaced, gasping, and already fighting to maintain his position, as the current tried to sweep him downstream. His eyes searched frantically for any sign of the drowning victim, but the churning water made visibility almost impossible. White foam and debris filled his vision, and the roar of the rapids drowned out any sounds that might have guided him toward his target. "Think like the river," he told himself, remembering advice from an old-timer who had taught him to fish these waters as a boy. "Don't fight it directly. Use its energy, work with the current instead of against it." He angled his body and began swimming diagonally across the flow, using the water's momentum to carry him downstream, while gradually moving toward the far bank where the current typically swept floating objects. Maria was beyond rational thought now, operating on pure survival instinct and the stubborn Apache determination that had carried her people through centuries of hardship. Each time the river pulled her under, she clawed her way back to the surface with movements that were becoming increasingly desperate and uncoordinated. Her lungs burned, her muscles cramped from the cold. and her vision kept tunneling into blackness that she had to fight to escape. The ceremonial dress that connected her to her ancestors had become a waterlogged anchor, dragging her down and tangling around her legs. With movements that would have broken her grandmother's heart, she began tearing at the fabric, ripping away pieces of the beautiful garment in a desperate attempt to shed weight and improve her mobility. Beads scattered in the current like tiny prayers being carried away by forces beyond her control. She managed to surface near a partially submerged boulder, grabbing desperately at the rock's slippery surface. For a moment, she thought she had found salvation, something solid to hold on to while she caught her breath and planned her next move. But the current was too strong, and her hands too numb from cold to maintain their grip. The river pried her loose and sent her tumbling back into the chaos of white water and spinning debris. Daniel saw her go under near the boulder and adjusted his course, swimming hard against a cross-current that wanted to push him into the same trap that had nearly claimed his quarry. His prison-softened muscles were already beginning to protest the unaccustomed exertion, but he pushed through the growing burn in his shoulders and chest. He had committed to this rescue, and commitment meant seeing it through regardless of the cost. The next time Maria surfaced, she was less than 30 feet ahead of him, but those 30 feet might as well have been 30 miles. She was weakening visibly, her movements becoming more erratic and less effective. Daniel could see that she wouldn't last much longer. Hypothermia and exhaustion were winning their race against whatever fighting spirit had kept her alive this long. He dug deeper, calling on reserves of strength and determination that he hadn't accessed since his arrest. Prison life had a way of making you forget what you were capable of when everything was on the line. But the river was reminding him of who he had been before the drugs and desperation had led him down the path to this orange jumpsuit and these chains. Maria's head went under again, and this time she didn't immediately surface. Daniel's heart hammered as precious seconds ticked by without any sign of her. He dove under, fighting the current and the murky water to search for any trace of the drowning girl. His lungs screamed for air, but he forced himself to stay down, sweeping his arms through the water in increasingly desperate arcs. His hand brushed against fabric, then found an arm. He grabbed hold and kicked toward the surface, dragging the unconscious girl with him as his own vision began to darken from oxygen deprivation. They broke the surface together, both gasping, him from effort, her from the automatic reflex that had kept her alive even when consciousness had fled. Maria's eyes were closed, her face gray with cold and oxygen deprivation, but she was breathing. Daniel wrapped his arm around her chest in a textbook rescue carry, fighting to keep both their heads above water while the current continued to push them downstream. She was smaller than he had expected, probably still a teenager, with the delicate bone structure that spoke of Apache heritage. The rescue was only half accomplished. Now he had to find a way to get them both out of the water before hypothermia finished what the river had started. Daniel looked around, trying to orient himself while maintaining his grip on the unconscious girl. The riverbank was steep and rocky on both sides, offering few options for an easy exit, but downstream, maybe 100 yards away, he could see a sandbar that extended into the river like a reaching hand. If he could angle their trajectory correctly, if the current cooperated, if his strength held out, he might be able to beach them there like a piece of driftwood washing ashore. He began the most difficult swim of his life, fighting the river's tendency to push him toward the wrong bank while supporting the dead weight of an unconscious victim. Every stroke was a negotiation with physics and fate, every breath a borrowed gift that might be his last. His legs were beginning to cramp from the cold water, and his shoulders burned with the effort of keeping them both afloat. Behind him, upstream at the bridge, Officer Gonzalez was coordinating a response that involved half the emergency services in Riverside County. Fire department river rescue teams were racing toward downstream intercept points, while helicopter units prepared for water extraction if the opportunity arose. But everyone involved knew that the real rescue was taking place right now in the churning water, being carried out by a convicted felon who had risked everything on a stranger's life. The sandbar was getting closer, but Daniel's strength was fading fast. Each stroke required more effort to produce less forward motion, and he could feel his body beginning to shut down from the combination of cold water and exhaustion. Maria remained unconscious in his arms, her breathing shallow but steady, her weight both the purpose and the limitation of his rescue attempt. 20 feet from the sandbar, Daniel realized he wasn't going to make it. The current was too strong, his energy too depleted, his muscles too compromised by cold and fatigue. The river was going to carry them past their best chance of escape, and then there would be nothing but more rapids, more rocks, more opportunities for the water to claim both their lives. But sometimes when everything seems lost, when physics and probability have stacked the odds impossibly high against survival, Human will finds a way to tip the balance. Maybe it was the memory of his daughter's face, or the weight of all the mistakes he wanted a chance to correct. Maybe it was simply the stubborn refusal to let this girl die on his watch after he had come so far and risked so much to pull her from the river's grasp. Daniel found another gear, some reserve of strength that existed beyond his body's normal limitations. With movements that felt like they were tearing his muscles apart, he angled toward the sandbar and began the final push that would determine whether this rescue attempt became a salvation or a double tragedy. The shallow water near the sandbar caught them like a gentle hand, slowing their momentum and allowing Daniel to find footing on the sandy bottom. He half-carried, half-dragged Maria onto the narrow beach, then collapsed beside her, both of them soaked and shivering but alive. Maria's eyes fluttered open as her body registered the feeling of solid ground beneath her. She looked up at Daniel with confusion and growing awareness, trying to process how she had gone from drowning to lying on a riverbank with a stranger in prison clothes kneeling beside her. "You're okay," Daniel gasped between gulps of air. "You're safe now." She tried to sit up, then thought better of it as the world spun around her. Who are you?" Before Daniel could answer, the sound of approaching engines filled the air. The first fire department rescue boat rounded the bend in the river, its crew scanning the water for signs of the reported victims. Daniel waved his arms, signaling their location, knowing that the next few minutes would bring questions he wasn't sure how to answer. Officer Gonzalez arrived moments later in a county sheriff's boat, her face showing relief and concern in equal measure. She had spent the last 20 minutes wondering whether her decision to trust a convicted felon would result in 2 deaths instead of none. As the rescue crews pulled Maria and Daniel into the boat, wrapping them in thermal blankets and beginning medical assessments, the full weight of what had happened began to settle over everyone involved. A prisoner had broken free from his restraints, risked his own life, and successfully rescued a drowning stranger. It was the kind of story that challenged assumptions about human nature and the possibility of redemption. Maria, now conscious and warming up under the care of paramedics, kept looking at Daniel with an expression that mixed gratitude with bewilderment. She had grown up hearing stories of heroes and warriors, of people who risked everything to protect others, but she had never expected to owe her life to someone society had labeled as untrustworthy and dangerous. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the boat engine. Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He was thinking about second chances and the strange ways that fate sometimes offers redemption when you least expect it. 3 months left on his sentence had suddenly become 3 months. To figure out how to live with being called a hero by the same system that had branded him a criminal. As they reached the boat launch where ambulances waited, Daniel caught sight of news crews setting up their cameras. The story was already spreading beyond the immediate circle of emergency responders and corrections officers. By evening, it would be on the local news. By morning, it might be national. The prisoner who had broken free to save a life was about to discover that some chains are easier to escape than others, and that sometimes becoming a hero creates more complications than remaining a criminal ever did. But for now, sitting in the rescue boat with thermal blankets around their shoulders and the solid feeling of survival warming their bones, both Daniel and Maria were content to simply be alive and to marvel at the strange circumstances that had brought them together in the churning waters of a flood-swollen river. The Apache girl and the convicted felon had both entered the water as one kind of person and emerged as someone entirely different. The river had tested them both and found them worthy of survival, but the real test was just beginning. They would both have to figure out how to live with what had happened and what it meant for the rest of their lives. Behind them, the river continued its eternal journey toward the sea, carrying away the debris of their near tragedy and leaving behind only the questions that would define everything that came after this moment of salvation and grace. The Riverside County Medical Center buzzed with an energy that felt different from the usual rhythm of emergency medicine. Word had spread quickly through the hospital corridors about the unusual rescue that had brought in 2 patients, the young Apache woman who had nearly drowned, and the prisoner who had risked everything to save her. Nurses and doctors found reasons to walk past their rooms, curious about the people behind a story that was already being called remarkable by those who had witnessed it. Maria Nietzsche lay in her hospital bed, warmed for the first time in hours, her body slowly recovering from hypothermia and near drowning. The doctors had pronounced her incredibly lucky. A few more minutes in the water might have resulted in permanent brain damage or death, but physical recovery was only part of her healing process. The psychological impact of nearly dying was something that would take much longer to process. Her grandmother, Elena Nietzsche, sat beside the bed like a guardian spirit, her weathered hands holding Maria's while she whispered prayers in Apache that had been passed down through generations. Elena was 73 years old and had lived through enough tragedy to understand that survival always came with obligations. Her granddaughter had been saved for a reason, and it would be Maria's responsibility to figure out what that reason was.
"Grandmother," Maria said softly, her voice still hoarse from the river water she had swallowed.
The man who saved me. Why would someone like that risk his life for mine? Elena's eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen enough of life to know that people rarely fit into the simple categories that society tries to create for them. Sometimes, she said in English, accented with the rhythms of her native language, the spirits use broken people to do their most important work. A man's mistakes do not erase his capacity for goodness. In a room 3 doors down, Daniel Martinez was having his own conversation with the complexities of heroism and redemption. Detective Sarah Chen from the Riverside County Sheriff's Department sat in the chair normally reserved for visitors, her notebook open but largely ignored as she tried to wrap her mind around the unusual circumstances that had brought her here. "So you removed your own restraints?" she asked for the 3rd time, still not quite believing the story she was hearing. "Officer Gonzalez removed them," Daniel corrected. "I asked her to, but she made the decision. I couldn't have gotten out of those leg chains on my own even if I wanted to." Detective Chen made another note, knowing that Officer Gonzalez was facing her own investigation for the decision to unshackle a prisoner without authorization. The department was struggling with how to handle a situation where breaking protocol had resulted in saving a life rather than creating a public safety incident. "And you had no prior knowledge of the victim? No connection to her family or community?" Daniel shook his head. "I'd never seen her before in my life. I just saw someone drowning and knew I had to do something." The simple honesty of his answer was somehow more compelling than any elaborate explanation might have been. Detective Chen had interviewed hundreds of criminals during her career, and she had developed a reliable instinct for detecting deception. Everything about Daniel Martinez's demeanor suggested that he was telling the truth about his motivations, which made his actions all the more remarkable. "The media wants to interview you," she said, closing her notebook. "There are at least 6 news crews outside, and more arriving every hour. This story is getting national attention." Daniel winced. He had hoped to serve out his remaining sentence quietly and return to some semblance of normal life without drawing attention to himself. The prospect of becoming a public figure, even a heroic one, felt almost as daunting as the river rescue had been. "Do I have to talk to them?" he asked. "Not while you're in custody. But Daniel, this attention isn't going away. What you did today is going to follow you for the rest of your life. You might want to think about how you want to handle that." 3 floors up in the hospital administration office, a different kind of drama was unfolding. Hospital attorney Margaret Flores was fielding phone calls from news organizations while simultaneously trying to navigate the legal complexities of having a prisoner as a patient. Technically, Daniel was still serving his sentence and remained in the custody of the corrections department, even though he was being treated as a hero by everyone who had heard his story. The calls weren't just from local media anymore. CNN had reached out, along with several national morning shows and at least 2 publishers who wanted to discuss book deals. The story had everything that American audiences loved: redemption, heroism, sacrifice, and the kind of moral complexity that generated debates and discussion. But the attention was creating complications that nobody had anticipated. The Apache community was protective of Maria's privacy, and several tribal leaders had expressed concern about their young woman being turned into a media spectacle. The corrections department was struggling with how to handle a prisoner who had become more famous than most celebrities, and Maria herself was overwhelmed by the prospect of having her near-death experience become entertainment for millions of strangers. By evening, the hospital parking lot looked like a news convention. Satellite trucks lined the street, and reporters with perfectly styled hair practiced their lead-ins while camera crews checked their equipment. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing beyond the simple facts of what had happened in the river, to become something larger about human nature, second chances, and the possibility of redemption. Inside the hospital, Maria had been moved to a private room to protect her from the media attention. Her family had gathered, aunts and uncles and cousins who had driven from across Arizona to be with her. They filled the room with the quiet strength that seemed to characterize the Apache approach to crisis, offering support through presence rather than words. Her cousin David, who worked as a social worker in Phoenix, had appointed himself as the family's spokesperson and media filter. He understood better than most how quickly a story like this could spiral out of control, how easily Maria could become defined by this single traumatic event, rather than by the full complexity of her life and dreams. She's not doing interviews, he told reporters who had managed to find their way to the hospital corridors. She needs time to recover, both physically and emotionally. Please respect her privacy and that of her family. But privacy was becoming a luxury that none of the people involved in the rescue could afford. By the next morning, photos of both Maria and Daniel were being broadcast across the country. The image of the young Apache woman being pulled from the water had become symbolic of vulnerability and survival, while pictures of Daniel in his orange jumpsuit had sparked debates about criminal justice, redemption, and who deserved to be called a hero. The story had touched something deep in the American consciousness, tapping into fundamental questions about human nature and the possibility of change. Online forums filled with discussions about Daniel's motivations, Maria's survival, and what their story meant for broader questions about crime, punishment, and forgiveness. Some commenters focused on Daniel's criminal record, arguing that his heroic actions didn't erase his past mistakes and that society shouldn't romanticize the behavior of convicted felons. Others saw his rescue of Maria as proof that people could change, that redemption was possible, even for those who had made serious mistakes. The Apache community found itself thrust into a spotlight that many members found uncomfortable. Maria's rescue had become a symbol for non-native audiences, who knew little about Apache culture or history, and there was concern that their actual lives and struggles were being overlooked in favor of a simplified narrative that fit neatly into news segments and social media posts. 3 days after the rescue, Maria was discharged from the hospital. Her physical recovery was complete, but she carried with her the weight of unwanted fame and the complex emotions that came with owing her life to someone society had labeled as dangerous. She had asked to meet Daniel before leaving the hospital, but the corrections department had denied the request, citing security concerns and the irregular nature of the situation. Daniel remained under guard in his hospital room, his medical care complicated by the need to maintain his prisoner status while accommodating the media circus that surrounded his presence. The corrections department was reviewing his case, trying to determine how his actions might affect his sentence and parole eligibility. There was precedent for heroic acts by inmates resulting in reduced sentences, but there was also concern about creating incentives for prisoners to seek dangerous situations in pursuit of early release. Officer Patricia Gonzalez was facing her own reckoning. Her decision to remove Daniel's restraints had saved a life, but it had also violated department policy and created a situation that her superiors were still trying to figure out how to handle. She was on administrative leave pending a full investigation, her career hanging in the balance while lawyers and administrators debated whether her actions constituted heroic judgment or dangerous negligence. The story's impact rippled outward in ways that surprised everyone involved. Prison reform advocates seized on Daniel's heroism as evidence that the current criminal justice system failed to recognize the humanity and potential of incarcerated individuals. Victims' rights groups worried that the focus on Daniel's heroism might overshadow the trauma experienced by Maria and send the wrong message about the relationship between crime and consequence. Maria returned to the reservation to find her community divided in their response to her newfound fame. Some saw her rescue as a blessing that reflected the strength and resilience of Apache people. Others worried that the media attention would bring unwanted scrutiny to their community and reduce their complex culture to simple stereotypes about Native Americans and their relationship with nature. Her grandmother, Elena, had perhaps the most balanced perspective on the situation. "This thing that happened to you," she told Maria, as they sat together in the small house where 4 generations of Naichi women had lived. "It will change everything about your life. People will want to make it mean things that it doesn't mean, and they will try to make you into someone you are not. You must remember who you were before the river, and you must decide who you want to be after." Maria nodded, understanding that her grandmother was offering wisdom that went beyond the immediate crisis of media attention. The experience had changed her in ways she was still discovering, and the attention it had generated was forcing her to examine questions about identity, purpose, and responsibility that she had never expected to face at 17. Meanwhile, Daniel was discovering that heroism came with its own form of imprisonment. Every decision about his future was being scrutinized by people who had never met him, but felt entitled to opinions about his character, his motivations, and his deservingness of forgiveness. The simple act of jumping into a river to save a drowning person had become complicated by the machinery of fame, justice, and public opinion. 1 month after the rescue, both Daniel and Maria were still grappling with the consequences of those 60 seconds that had changed everything. Daniel's sentence had been reduced for his heroic actions, but he found that freedom from prison was different from freedom from the story that had made him famous. Maria had returned to school and her normal routine, But she carried with her the knowledge that her life had been saved by someone the world had written off as worthless. They had never spoken to each other after the rescue, but they remained connected by the shared experience of that moment when everything had hung in the balance and human decency had proved stronger than the current that had threatened to claim them both. The river continued to flow, indifferent to the human dramas it had witnessed. But for two people whose lives had intersected in its churning waters, everything had changed. They had learned that heroism could come from unexpected places, that survival created obligations to live with purpose, and that sometimes the most profound moments of human connection happened between strangers who risked everything for each other without thought of reward or recognition. Their story became part of the larger American narrative about second chances, redemption, and the complicated nature of heroism. But for Maria and Daniel, it remained something much simpler and more personal. The moment when one human being chose to save another, and both of their lives were transformed by the choice to value a stranger's survival above their own safety. Years later, they would both look back on that day as the moment when they discovered who they really were beneath all the labels and assumptions that society had placed on them. In the end, that discovery proved to be the most valuable rescue of all. Young Apache falls into the rapids. A prisoner breaks free and dives in to save her.